It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
They've agreed to put in 10,000 soldiers permanently, like forever, 10,000 soldiers at their side of the border. We haven't agreed on tariffs yet, and maybe we will, maybe we won't.
Donald Trump suspends tariffs on Mexico and Canada after they agreed to border security measures. What does this tell us about how to deal with the president? Keir Starmer thinks he can have a reset with EU leaders and be close to the White House. Is he right?
Both of these relations are very important to us. We are not choosing between them, but that's historically been the position of the UK for many, many decades now.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
That was almost 5 years ago, but have we learnt the right lessons from the COVID pandemic? Also today...
I am really clear on this. Every piece of evidence there is suggests that a bit of flexibility, agreed between employer and employee, is good for productivity, it's good for resilience, it's good for people doing the job.
That was the business secretary. Will more working from home really boost the economy? Joining me, Labour MP Mike Tapp, Conservative MP and Shadow Foreign Minister Wendy Morton, Liberal Democrat MP and Chair of the Health Committee Layla Moran, and Tom Slater, Editor of Spiked Online. This is Politics Live. Let's start with Donald Trump and those tariffs. Showing you this headline overnight in BBC News. Trump's 10% tariff on China begins as Beijing plans retaliation on US energy and some cars. Yes, you'll have heard it yesterday, the plan by Donald Trump to impose those tariffs on China. They have and they are planning to hit back. It comes against movement and news that the tariffs on Canada and Mexico by Donald Trump have been suspended for a month. And this is the headline. Here, Canada and Mexico avoid trade war kicking in at midnight. This is because Canada, who said they'd already proposed these measures, but they are going to tackle the US concerns over border control and drugs, particularly fentanyl. But my opening question, starting with you, actually, Layla, today to ring the changes, is what does this tell us about how we should deal with Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, we have been here before, and, you know, barely a day will go by where another thing Trump said makes us all go, well, what's he done now? And I think this is going to be the next 4 years. But we know, and we should have learned by now, that he's a playground bully. You know, this is a guy who responds to strength. He responds to a little bit of flattery. Who doesn't? But he especially, it would seem. I think the way that we tackle Trump is to be really strong about what we will and won't do. And also to pick a horse. I mean, I understand what the government's trying to do, right? Both, you know, easy as she goes. But if we've got to make a choice, clearly the choice should be the European Union. They are our closest trading partner. They offer the most to our economy. And if we have to choose, I think we've got to be clear about that. That will help with Trump too. Well,
you're in line, of course, with the party leader, Ed Davey. We can show his tweet. The UK mustn't let Donald Trump bully us or our ally, Canada. He goes on to say we can't just sit back and hope Trump won't hit us with tariffs. He's proven time and again how unpredictable he is. How would you characterise Donald Trump? As a bully?
I'd say he's transactional. And I would also say that he's made very clear that he's willing to use tariffs not just as a kind of long-term economic policy, but as one to get short-term political gains for himself. He's telegraphed that very clearly. Now it falls to us to how to respond. I know that there is a certain type of Remainer who the answer to every question is that we should get closer to the European Union. I think in the context of Trump threatening tariffs against the European Union, that's a slightly harder position to maintain. I don't think we should be under the thumb of the US. I don't think we should be under the thumb of the EU. I think we should make our own decisions, box as clever as possible, recognise how things have changed with the new US administration and just keep our own national interest front and centre. I think surely most people can agree that's the right way to deal with any US administration.
Mike Tapp, do you agree with Layla Moran and Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrat Party leader, that he's a bully, Donald Trump?
No, I don't. Actually, I have a lot of respect for the victory that he's just won in the United States, and we mustn't ignore that. You know, he's increased vote shares across almost every voter demographic, so we mustn't ignore that. Look, he drives a hard bargain. We know that. But But we've got that, £300 billion worth of trade with the United States, 1.2 trillion of investment. And of course, the deal that we go on to strike will be in the interests of Britain. It's within our values to have that firmness to put what we need first. But of course, we'll be in those negotiations.
Right. I mean, if we look again at the Ed Davey tweet, Wendy Morton, we can't just sit back and hope Trump won't hit us with tariffs. He's proven time and again how unpredictable he is. Trump doesn't care who gets hurt. He'll use people's businesses and livelihoods as leverage. We must stand together against his attempts to divide us.
I think the thing here for me is that we can't underestimate the importance of the UK-US relationship. As Mike said, Trump is the elected president of the US. He is, I feel, a strong bargainer. He's a businessman. He comes with a different skill set. But I think the importance of the UK getting the best deal for us is what really, really matters. But what we've been seeing today is, the Prime Minister's having to walk almost a tightrope here, because on the one hand, it feels like he's actually trying to inch us back into the EU through the back door, doesn't quite know what to do with Trump. When we were in government, we did start to set out what we would do. We've got trade deals, and it has to be about putting the UK's interests first here.
That's really interesting, Wendy, because on the one hand, we've got Nick Thomas-Symonds today giving a speech in Brussels where
the Labour politician doing the negotiations.
Where SBS agreement, the veterinary agreement, which is actually really important for British goods, is being suggested as one of the things that might come forward as part of a summit in May. And on the other hand, I remember vividly going out to talk to Trump's people when I was a member of the Public Accounts Committee many parliaments ago now, and then being very clear that actually what they want access to in our markets is farmers and fisheries, and they want to be able to flood our market with lower welfare foods, and that was top of their list of things that they wanted in sector-by-sector deals or however.
But do you think a US-UK trade deal is actually even on the table?
Well, I mean, Wendy's just suggesting that was one of the things that was in train, and I wonder if, we shouldn't be taking any lessons from the Conservative Party about how to land a deal with anyone.
Layla, with all due respect, you would just rather we went back into the EU, which to me,
the position currently
means that,
well, let her finish. I'll come back.
Actually, absolutely goes against the referendum.
Okay.
It goes against the will of the British
and the
people.
manifesto that we were elected on, of course.
And let's be clear about the
finish on this.
Let's finish, and then I will come.
I speak as somebody who, I did vote Remain. I had some concerns, but I am a Democrat, and I am I believe in one thing, which is pragmatic decision making and delivering on what people asked us to do, and that is why I will go out there banging the drum for the UK and making sure that the deal that we delivered 5 years ago is not undermined, and we don't see it coming into the EU through the back door.
Look, everyone that I speak to in Oxford, West and Abingdon thinks the deal that the Conservatives struck was a botched deal. It is not delivered for the British.
Brownhills, Layla.
It has absolutely not delivered for the British people. But let's be clear about the Liberal Democrat position currently. It is not to sort of go ahead of ourselves. It's listening to small businesses.
But eventually you would
and
like
it's
to.
wanting, no, we're very clear about who we are. It's unsurprising to no one. But that said, small businesses tell us all the time they want to remove barriers to trade. And what we're talking about is a customs union. If Turkey can have one, surely we can negotiate one.
Tom?
I mean, there's a reason that the only states who aren't EU member states who are part of the customs union is Turkey and a handful of micro-statelets. It's because it's a terrible deal. It's because it would mean being subject to EU trade agreements which have been made, but at the same time there'd be no reciprocity. You see that with Turkey, where they have to import Mexican cars tariff-free, but if they're trying to export their clothes, they've got to pay a 20% tariff. It's obviously a bad deal. It's a staging post towards rejoining the European Union. I know you're relatively honest about that, but at the same time,
well, there are polls that
suggest
there are polls that have consistently suggested that actually they would like a closer relationship.
But it's also wrong to say that we don't currently already follow EU rules. Look at the bottle caps at the moment. Okay, now
wonderful they are.
Love them or hate them. I personally don't love them. But that said, we had nothing to do with those. In terms of any negotiation, we just have to accept it because big business will follow what the EU does. And currently there is no mechanism whatsoever to feed in. With a customs union agreement, like Turkey, we would at least have a mechanism to feed in and have a say. At the moment, we've got none, and we have no recourse at all.
Well, we've moved on to relations with the EU, and Keir Starmer was in Brussels yesterday to speak to other European leaders about a reset of the relationship between the UK and the European Union. Union. It's on several of the front papers. Let's have a look at them. The Times, Prime Minister won't back EU in trade war. This is all about the discussion and debate about whether you back, as Layla says, the EU firmly, or you try and straddle both the EU and the US. If we have a look at the Daily Mail, what a time to be crawling back to the EU as Trump threatens trade war with the European Union but hints at sparing UK. Starmer begs Brussels for closer ties at Palace banquet. And finally, this is in the I-paper. We talked about it a little bit yesterday. UK cabinet tensions on Brexit migration deal for under 30s as Germany makes new plea to Starmer. Of course, there was that meeting at Chequers between Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, and Keir Starmer at the weekend. Let's have a listen to Keir Starmer at his press conference that he held with NATO Chief Mark Rutte. It was ahead of the dinner with EU leaders last night.
I do think there's a very important discussion to be had about how we increase our security and defence work together in a very volatile world. But also, I will touch on the wider reset, which goes beyond defence and security, into the fields of energy and into trade and the economy. And so, back to where I started, really, both of these relations are very important to us. We are not choosing between them.
Let's talk to the BBC's economics editor, Faisal Islam, about that choice. Is Keir Starmer right, Faisal, that he doesn't have to choose, essentially, between the EU and the US?
Hi, Joe. Yeah, I think right now that is a fair position because we're not entirely certain exactly, for example, where the US how ambitious they might want to be with any type of arrangement, trade arrangement with the UK. And we're not entirely sure about the contours of the arrangement with Europe. And so you kind of see the Prime Minister slightly sitting on the fence as regards the tariff war that has started to break out. I don't think that will hold. There are specific things where I think a choice will be required. The most obvious thing is something you've just been talking about, is this issue of the veterinary agreement. Now, this was a manifesto commitment from Labour to essentially allow a set of relations with Europe over farm and food exports that was closer, that allowed certainly fewer checks, but there could be a version of this, a sort of full fat veterinary agreement, which kind of got rid of almost everything in terms of the checks, but that would require following EU rules. So that is, I put that to cabinet ministers. Is that ruled out by the red lines? And they say it's not. A veterinary agreement negotiating some sort was a manifesto commitment. But if they were to do that, Joe, then that would knock out the concept of some sort of a full fat free trade agreement with the US.
Right. I mean, while you talk about that veterinary agreement and that smoother trade, closer alignment with the EU in terms of rules, would it really boost the economy? Would it boost growth in the UK, which is the core mission of the Starmer government?
Well, the first thing to say is I can't quite understand why the government hasn't commissioned any research on this. I mean, there are a number of different papers that do suggest that the frictions that we've seen, what we call the non-tariff barriers that were created by the Brexit process, that they have affected particularly smaller businesses. There's thousands of businesses that, according to the data, used to export to the European Union that don't anymore. How much that adds up to in terms of GDP, I think the other bit of evidence here is that maybe some of the bigger businesses, once they've paid the costs of making an adjustment, they've managed to cope with that better. Service sector exports have done better than expected. Actually, if you looked at the data, it might be that there's a way to square both of these circles. And this is what you might think could happen. On goods, you could lean closer to Europe to deal with some of those frictions in order to help particularly small businesses that find it very tough to fill out all these forms and have, the market has shrunk for them because it's more difficult to compete. But on things like services, on tech, on AI, on pharma, where there are now Brexit freedoms, which have done better than many expectations, take advantage of those freedoms, maybe do some deals with not just the US, but other countries. They don't want to articulate any strategy like that at all at the moment, but they're going to have to put their cards on the table, and pretty soon. the mood music we're getting from Europe is that the summit date might be May the 19th.
Yes.
Intriguing for you that would be just after
the local elections. Exactly. No, we can see a timing plan falling into place here, Faisal, with those questions. But yes, I think we can confirm that is going to take place that week of the 19th, if not on the day, that summit. So ahead of that, we'll keep asking the questions, and of our Labour MP here. Faisal, thank you very much for joining us. You fully support and would like the government to go full steam ahead with that veterinary agreement. Much closer alignment, more frictionless trade. Oh, sorry, Faisal, I'm asking Mike Tapp. Yeah.
Look, I mean, Nick Thomas-Symonds has laid out in his speech earlier today that there's a 3-month timeline on this, which I think is really important because these things can drag on for a long time and we can get this pushed through. In terms of the veterinary
I'm just asking for, on principle, you're fully signed up to that and think the government should press ahead?
As long as we're sticking to our manifesto commitment of not rejoining the customs union or the single market, because that's what we're elected on, then I support what we do if it benefits British farmers and British businesses. That's really important.
And what will you give in return?
What, to the
EU?
Well, look, a part of negotiations is being skilled diplomats, and skilled diplomats don't go on news channels at the beginning of
no, but you will have to give
talks
something, won't you?
And pushing it out under pressure. Of course, that's happening behind the scenes. We're not going to give a running commentary on that, but I'm really confident that we'll get the best deal for this country. Right,
but listening to Faisal Islam there, Wendy, it doesn't sound like the deal that you have reiterated your support for, the one that was signed by previous Conservative governments, is working. There is friction in trade. So surely, if you can get the advantages of signing up to this, what we call this veterinary agreement, but more frictionless trade on farm products and food products, then you're behind it.
But actually, look, we still, if the government is in the process of negotiating something, they are going to have to give something. Yeah. And this is the thing that absolutely worries me more than anything else. Why? Because that's the nature of negotiations. You want something, you have to give something. What are they going to do? It feels I'm really worried that this is just the thin end of the wedge to a slow, closer alignment with the EU and a going back in. Don't forget, Joe, we have a Prime Minister, and I remember this because I was a whip during those years, who voted 48 times on the Brexit bills, and he campaigned for a second referendum. So I think that's why we've got every right to question and feel unsure and uncertain. And I'm come from a business background. I speak to businesses day in, day out, my farmers. This uncertainty, on top of uncertainty that they're already feeling here with farmers' tax, employer national insurance.
But if it boosts growth, and it's good for the economy.
But there's a here and now situation and businesses are hurting at the moment.
Right. I mean, one of the things that the government might have on the table is this headline in the iPaper about what they call a youth mobility scheme. You can argue about whether that's freedom of movement or not. Should they give way on that in order to get frictionless trade?
Absolutely. That is, first of all, absolutely not freedom of movement. It's under 30s only. They come and then they go back. And secondly, this is in our interests too. It's not that we're suddenly going to be flooded by young European people who can be baristas and bartenders, which frankly would be welcome in my local pubs because they have closed as a result. But actually it's for opportunities, particularly for young people from poorer backgrounds. It was those young people who were the most affected by this. The richer ones, frankly, could go and do their sort of European tour and gap years and whatever anyway. It was the ones who didn't have the money who benefited most from schemes like Erasmus.
Is it freedom?
But is it
freedom of movement?
It's not freedom of movement, but at the same time, it's probably politically untenable in a situation where the government is trying to bring down immigration from historic highs. That's just the nature of the situation.
Off a manifesto to respect Brexit and to bring down immigration. And that's what we're going to do.
And get growth. But what are you going to do?
People don't trust you on either, that's the point.
Yes, but it is a negotiation. You will have to give something, and I'm struggling to see what it is you're going to give. If it's not on a youth mobility scheme, what else could possibly be there?
You're going to end up signing up to dynamic alignment.
It's alignment with standards. That's what they're asking for. And we've got generally higher...
It's absolutely
We've got generally higher welfare standards. I mean, look, when I speak to businesses, what they say is that it's important. They're aligning to standards anyway, because many of them want to be able to trade into Europe. They just can't. There's 20 to 30,000 fewer small businesses in this country now who trade with the EU than when we were in. And that matters. These are small traders who can't afford to set up these subsidiaries in Paris or Dublin or whatever, and they've lost their livelihoods. Now, if we can do something for them, that's surely good for the economy.
Absolutely, and it's within everyone's interest to reach an agreement on SBS and many other things on the basis of mutual recognition, saying that we're starting from a position moral standards are very similar because we didn't leave the European Union very long ago. But that's not what the EU demand. They demand that we submit to their rule book, that we submit to, even further, to the European Court of Justice. People voted for democracy and national independence. That obviously grates up against it. And just because it stops short of full membership of the single market or the customs union doesn't mean it's not a betrayal of what people voted for.
I mean, what's wrong with the government's position? I mean, what's wrong with the
Absolutely
government's
nothing.
trying... No, I'm asking Labour. I know you don't think there's anything wrong with the government's position.
But I think it's a good start.
Oh, right, OK.
So I know, I do think it's a good start. But I would...
Going back into the EU?
But can I finish? I do think that if the government was more ambitious and said it would want to negotiate a customs union, some of the things like an SBS agreement, like a veterinary agreement, would be easier to achieve because there is a direction of travel there and it would be more likely the EU would be able to say yes.
Right. I mean, you were a supporter of Theresa May, I'm right in saying, and not wanting to go over those painful years of division during the Brexit years. But can I take it that actually you would be minded to support a deal similar to the one that she negotiated, which wasn't a full customs union, but it was quite close?
But I think we tried to get that through Parliament and we were unsuccessful.
But you supported the idea in principle.
Yeah, but we've now got a deal as to where we're at now. What I want to do is make sure that what we do not see is an unpicking and a leading back into the EU, because I think it feels very much like not only is the Prime Minister sort of teetering on a tightrope here, but he's gone to Brussels with a begging bowl.
But when
when you are negotiating,
really
there's always something that...
Well, hang on, let me get Mike, because you said it was a begging bowl.
The newspaper front pages that you showed us and these sort of comments are actually, with respect, quite ridiculous. You know, of course they are. We must be talking with our closest neighbours. The deal that we've inherited isn't fit for purpose. So, of course, we need to go and make that better for this country. That's what we're doing.
Right.
It's about trust, isn't it? And we've had Brexit, we've had the referendum.
And the
you
trust
can
has been
talk
put in the
to
Labour
whoever
Party at last
partners
election.
you want in government. That is part of building relationships. But where does Keir Starmer actually sit? As I said, he voted 48 times against Brexit. He's talked about...
I can tell you exactly where he sits.
Let me finish. A second referendum. This is the problem.
Right, but Wendy, is your record, the Conservatives' record on Brexit generally, one to be proud of?
I'll tell you what our record is. We got Brexit done. And the other thing is that
to quote Boris Johnson,
the economy.
During COVID, we would not have been able to roll out that vaccine as quickly as we did. That was one of the Brexit benefits.
Well, let me put to you what Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, said quite recently. She said that announcing the UK was leaving the EU without having a growth plan in place, was a mistake. Is she right?
That is Kemi's opinion. We are where we are. For me, the most important thing here is that we have to be pragmatic, help our businesses and grow our economy. And we are not seeing the current government grow our economy. Far from it.
Right, but with it, well, I'll let you come back on that in just a moment. But also the former Brexit negotiator, Lord David Frost, in contrast to what Kemi Badenoch has said, told the Broadcasting House programme on BBC Radio 4 that the deal is working well. It's going perfectly.
Well, it sounds
he
like
said, who's correct?
I'm not going to be arbitrator on that. As I said, I'm about the here and now, making sure that I hold this government to account. And on this point about growth,
Wendy, do you think
there are
this is working?
13,000 businesses
that
this morning were reported as suffering because of the economy.
Try not to talk over each other, but yes, go on, Lena, and then must go to Tom.
Do you genuinely believe that the deal that you negotiated is working?
Look,
yes or no?
You're quite clear that you don't believe in Brexit and you don't believe in the will of...
Well, let her answer. Let her answer it.
So you made it very clear that your position is to go back into the EU. My position is not. My position is that we make this work. This will be a continuous process, but it doesn't mean going backwards and negotiating and giving in on things such as movement of people, migration.
We need to get a bit of perspective. I mean, actually getting Brexit over the line in the teeth of bitter opposition is one of the few things I do credit the last Conservative government with doing. I thought it was very important from the standpoint of trust in democracy. Is the deal perfect? Of course not. There's not a lot of Brexiteers who would suggest that is the case. But this kind of Mad Max dystopia, which is painted as a result of this deal, our trade with the EU has remained remarkably stable. Even, UK and a changing Europe make that point. We fundamentally voted for a more democratic politics. Have we ended up with the politicians and the governments to match? Not necessarily, but to act as if all of the things that have gone wrong in the economy are entirely down to a little bit more friction at the border. We've had a pandemic, war in Europe, spiralling energy prices. It's facile. Everyone knows it's facile.
Yeah, but what was consistent is the Office for Budget Responsibility. They said early on that the UK economy would be 4% smaller GDP-wise from leaving the EU than if we had stayed part of the European Union. Now, it doesn't take in mitigating things that the government might do, but do you hold by that? If you say you can't blame everything economically on Europe, what do you say to the OBR?
Because the point of Brexit was to say that, first of all, it's a point about democracy, which I've made. The point about the economy is to say that this is about saying that, yes, we are going to end up with a less smooth relationship with Europe because of the fact that the growth around the world is not in Europe, because of the fact that over time, not over a couple of years, that we're going to see increasing trade with the rest of the world. That's what's been lacking, kind of obviously, in a period of increasing geopolitical stability. But to look at this purely in and of itself and suggest that, as I say, a little bit more friction at the border is responsible for all of what ails us economically is ridiculous.
I would totally agree with that. I completely agree with that. No one I speak to is ever saying that. I think what is important to remember, though, there are some things that are in our gift, and there are some things that aren't. Like, you can't decide if a pandemic is going to come or not. Mm-hmm. We are certainly not responsible for the war in Ukraine. I was there 2 weeks ago. And what I found striking about it was there are EU flags everywhere, because actually the EU was more than just money. But we are talking about growth. We've got people really hurting in this country as a result of the cost of living crisis. And we say to ourselves as Liberal Democrats, what is the one thing, what is a lever we could pull to make lives better? And our answer is a customs union.
What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? If you want growth, and growth would be forthcoming, if you're like, if Layla is right, from joining some sort of customs union or getting close, why not do it? Right. That is your core mission.
So our core mission is growth, and that's domestically what we've seen since we've come into government is policy that will lead to growth. And look, we're seeing
we haven't seen that.
We're now seeing us as the second best country to invest in. 70% of businesses are looking at increasing their profits over the next year. That's up from 62%. If you don't mind, let me finish. I haven't had much time to speak. But also, we've got to bear in mind that we have been voted in on the manifesto that we put to the people, which is not to rejoin the customs union, and that's why we won't. But we, of course, are there at the moment. Nick's there, Keir's there to negotiate a better deal rather than the mess that we inherited from the Conservative Party. So we're working towards growth, both domestically and working with Europe.
Why didn't you put it in the manifesto? I mean, do you think, take away what you did put in, but take that away and the red line that is now there, do you agree with Layla Moran that if the UK joined a customs union with the European Union, would that bring growth? Would it bring growth or not?
Leading up to the general election that we will negotiate a better deal with Europe. Right. That's what we're voted in to do. That's what we're doing now.
And Keir Starmer's meeting with EU leaders will no doubt be one of the issues that comes up at Prime Minister's Questions tomorrow. Keir Starmer will face Kemi Badenoch at noon. We'll be on air on Politics Live from 11:15 to bring you all the build-up and reaction to that, so please join me then. And just to close off that discussion, Politico headline, EU leaders to travel to UK for Brexit Reset Summit in May. Something to put in your diary and look forward to. Now, as we heard at the beginning of the programme, it's almost 5 years ago that the World Health Organisation declared COVID a pandemic. Let's hear what our then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, had to say 5 years ago yesterday.
When there is a risk that new diseases such as coronavirus will trigger a panic and a desire for market segregation that go beyond what is medically rational to the point of doing real and unnecessary economic damage, then, at that moment, humanity needs some government somewhere that is willing at least to make the case powerfully for freedom of exchange. Some country ready to take off its Clark Kent spectacles and leap into the phone booth and emerge with its cloak flowing as the supercharged champion of the right of populations of the earth to buy and sell freely among each other. And here in Greenwich in the first week of February 2020, I can tell you in all humility that the UK is ready for that role.
So Boris Johnson sounding characteristically bullish at that point in early February, but this is what he had to say 7 weeks later.
If too many people become seriously unwell at one time, the NHS will be unable to handle it, meaning more people are likely to die, not just from coronavirus, but from other illnesses as well. From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Before we get to the difference, the contrast in the two approaches you heard there from the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, can I just ask all of you briefly for your reflections on that period of the COVID pandemic and at that point when we just had it announced?
It was really tough, and I was actually on a sabbatical with the Ministry of Defence at the time, helping my wife grow her small business, and overnight it plummeted. We lost half the business. Obviously managed to rebuild that, and that was the same for so many people across the country, and vulnerable folk not being able to go out. It was really, really tough, but great the way we pulled together as a nation, I think.
Wendy?
I think it was a really scary time, and I think it's easy to sit here and forget how we all felt sitting at home watching the TV. And undoubtedly, I think it has left us all. We'll always remember it. But I think we now judge things. Did we do something pre-COVID or post-COVID? And I think we are now still working through many of the consequences of COVID. But as from a government, I was in government at the time, and it was tough then. But I mean, when we have a national emergency, we rightly, as government and oppositions, will work together where it's in the national interest. But thank goodness we were able to get the vaccine and roll it out as quickly as we did.
Layla, your reflections?
Do you know, I think there are many people who are still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and there are also many who are still suffering from long COVID as a result of what happened in May 2020. I'm in touch with many of them. They were on the front line. Those days they decided they'd go into work, put themselves first, and got COVID so badly they are still off work. Many of them are still not receiving compensation. So my focus now is trying to get that for them. It's stuck in DWP. I really hope the government continues to listen. And I know in Andrew Gwynn we've got a minister in the Department of Health who suffered with long COVID himself. I know that there are advocates within government for this as well. But those frontline workers, I think we've kind of abandoned now. And I think back to them and the sacrifice they made. They were incredible. And I really hope we continue to remember them.
Tom?
I mean, there are plenty of people who were abandoned shamefully during that period, but it's not limited to the people who horrendously lost their lives as a consequence of COVID. We've also abandoned the tens of thousands of kids who essentially stopped going to school as a consequence of school closures that we now know were essentially not important to controlling the virus, but very important to people's life chances. The way in which the pandemic measures, the lockdown measures, were incredibly authoritarian. I mean, I think we all agreed something had to be done, but surely a more voluntary approach rather than something which involved the shredding of our civil liberties. I mean, Matt Hancock was effectively ruling by decree during that period. He was making and unmaking laws at the strike of his pen under the Public Health Act when his hands weren't otherwise engaged. Surely we should be concerned about this mass-scale theft of our civil liberties, the impact it's had on the economy and education, and the fact that we never seem to have an actual reckoning with that, partly because we've memory hold it, because we all want to move on, but also partly because I think all of the political parties were essentially in favour of this project of trying to fight a virus through authoritarianism. We need to start talking about that, because there's a lot of victims of the lockdown as well as the pandemic itself, which needs to be
What do you say to that point of Tom and how he's characterised the lockdowns?
The top-down approach, actually, I agree, wasn't necessarily helpful. So I set up the all-party parliamentary group on coronavirus during the pandemic, because one of the reasons we noticed was that Parliament was not getting time to debate this.
And purposely so.
We needed, well, perhaps, we needed cross-party to be looking at what the evidence was showing, what the science was saying, and how do we help the government to tackle this more effectively. Now, the public inquiry that's happened now and the testimonies, and you're absolutely right about the incompetence of Matt Hancock and that government at the time. Just
but
look
were
at
we stripped of our
Partygate.
liberties then in that way?
Well, we clearly were, but I would argue that the way to have done it better would have been to be more upfront with information earlier on with people, rather than to hide away. And actually, I think scrutiny and transparency was the key. We spoke to many behavioural scientists at the time who said, if you want to help people to take up these measures voluntarily, you do it by actually treating like the adults they are and allowing them to make these decisions on their own. And actually, you get better uptake of vaccines as a result. Right. So it wasn't an either-or. And actually, if we could have avoided the mandation, I would have agreed with that.
But also, at the time that Boris Johnson gave that address, people were already locking themselves down.
Yeah, we're looking at pictures here of lockdowns in the UK and actually in China.
Absolutely. But, you know, people's movements had dropped by about 70% by the time the national lockdown came in. People could be trusted to take this once-in-a-generation health crisis seriously. But because the view in government, because the view amongst the policymakers, because the view amongst certain people on stage was that you have to force them, otherwise they're not going to do it, we've ended up with all of these consequences, which otherwise we might have been able to ameliorate a lot easier.
I mean, Leila, I'll show you this tweet. I think we've showed it to you before, from August 2020. I've written to the Prime Minister in my role as chair of the cross-party coronavirus inquiry, which you've mentioned. Following over 1,000 evidence submissions, we recommend an urgent move to a zero-COVID strategy. And that would, well, I think China adopted it for a while, so did Australia.
The same way, I would add.
Right, but do you now, sitting here, think that that was the right approach, or would have been the right approach, zero COVID?
So what Zero Code was trying to say is that you aim for zero. It doesn't mean you get to zero, but you aim for zero. And what that means is you have better test and trace, and then you ask individuals to isolate themselves. But what we absolutely were not endorsing was the idea, and you saw in China, people being bundled into cars and into, that was absolutely not what we were saying. But the point was, and I did notice this, and I'll tell you a little anecdote from the time. A number of parliamentarians who I was chatting to early doors, and I was like, guys, this is serious. We need to take this seriously. If you don't move fast, it's going to overwhelm us, because this is exponential growth. I used to be a maths teacher, love this stuff. And it's exponential growth, and it means small numbers go big very quickly. And what I did notice was parliamentarians were really unable, I think, to grasp in the early stages what that meant as opposed to linear growth. Parliament is set up, government is set up for much slower growth than this. And if we had approached it, I think, in that way much earlier on, we might have avoided some of the subsequent damage that we've seen.
Right, so you admit there has been subsequent damage. I mean, did they go too far, those lockdowns? Was the instinct of Boris Johnson in the first excerpt we played the correct one? That, I mean, he used the words that it wasn't actually rational. Was that fair?
Well, I think, you know, Boris Johnson did a lot of things by the seat of his pants and by instinct. A lot of the times he was wrong. On this, I happen to think his original position was right. The fact that after all of this, after, as I say, the complete upending of the liberties that we experience in this country, the fact that we were under a situation in which everything was prohibited unless we were expressly told we were able to do it, the fact that we were being made to believe absurdities like a Scotch egg could ward off the presence of a virus, all of this should have brought us back to the question about trusting people to make these decisions. And also, as we look at it in the final analysis, and you see that however way you chart it, in terms of excess deaths, a country like Sweden, which took a very different path to us, is either at the bottom or near the bottom of excess deaths, tells us that another path that was more liberal, that trusted people, and that didn't have all these consequences could have been possible.
Hindsight's great, but it's right that we look back and reflect what's happened and we learn the lessons from it. I actually think we were right to lock down.
You do.
The vast majority of Europe was doing the same thing at that time, that when it first started.
So Boris Johnson's initial instinct wasn't the right one?
No, I said it was.
His initial one was probably not to.
When we moved to lockdown, and I think that was the right thing, is what I'm saying, Joe. Yeah. Because you had to think about what tools did we have at the time to deal with this virus that we knew very, very little about. And I think for me now, the key lessons are to the work of the Commission and looking at how it's left people feeling. But we mustn't lose sight of the importance of preparing in case there is another pandemic. Yep.
And I think for me,
there were two things that I really remember from the pandemic that I think as politicians we need to reflect on. One is preparing for the next pandemic, but the other is the impact that COVID had on our supply chains. If you were working in the manufacturing sector or in the food sector, all of a sudden a lot of those supply chains just ground to a halt. And I think these are things that we as legislators need to have in the back of our minds at all times, which is about the security of this country for our people, be that health security, be it food security, just like energy security.
Do you agree with Wendy or Tom?
In general, with Wendy, the government weren't prepared for this, and they should have been. PPE, for example, that led to fraudulent contracts and theft. At the same time, I think we locked down probably a week too late. I remember seeing it coming over quite literally, a wave from Italy, and we could have got there sooner and saved thousands of lives. I think lockdown was right because we've got to remember those graphs of ensuring the NHS wasn't overwhelmed. We had to keep that graph below, and the way of doing that was lockdown. But at the same time, there was some silliness there. I'll always remember the chaps walking in the Peak District getting fined. So the balance wasn't quite right, but it was
people
the right
were
approach.
issued with £10,000 fines for holding a house party. How is that supportable? That's the mad world that we entered into when we...
Well, on the sort of issue of COVID rules, this headline, BBC News, Starmer denies breaking COVID rules with voice coach. There are claims that as leader of the opposition in 2020, the Prime Minister had a voice coach present during preparations for a Brexit press conference. He says no rules were broken, telling reporters, of course, the rules are followed. Does that draw a line under it, or are there more questions to answer, Mike?
Well, of course, the opposition are going to jump on this bandwagon and sling the mud.
It's a legitimate question.
But he's been really clear, and I'll answer the question.
Yeah.
He's been very clear that he had to make a speech, I think it's on the 20th, because of a Brexit announcement. He has a small team around him. They prepared for it the day before.
Yeah, but he also said that if he'd broken the COVID rule, he would stand down. I mean, can you imagine if it'd been the shoe was on the other?
Well, this was happening. The Conservatives were parting in Downing Street, so we won't take any lectures.
I listened to you, so respectfully, you know, Boris was fine. Boris had the consequences of it.
He was found to have broken the rules.
Yeah, what I'm saying is
that
we need a proper investigation to get to the bottom of it.
One of the consequences that's certainly been accelerated in the minds of many people is this issue of working from home. The Daily Telegraph headline, Britain to remain working from home capital of Europe thanks to Rayner's, that's Angela Rayner's, Workers' Rights Plan, the Employment Rights Bill. Something to be proud of, Tom?
Well, first of all, I think we should note that this discussion about working from home basically affects a very small part of the workforce. Even at the height of COVID, it wasn't even a majority of people were working from home. And you saw the disparity very much between very rich areas and poor areas. People actually had to go out to work. So it's worth bearing that in mind. This working from home issue, of course, I think people and workers should be organising to fight for whatever working arrangements they deem appropriate. To do it from a top down, I'm less in favour of, because I think working from home as a general trend as well hasn't necessarily been that positive. It's often a war of the anecdotes, this discussion. Some people think it works great for me, other people say it works terribly for them. Interestingly, if you look at the surveys, it tends to be the higher ranking people in corporations who tend to do it rather than the lower ranking people anyway. So again, it's a bit of an elite discussion. But I think we have had this trend towards, accelerated by lockdown, a more atomised society, a less convivial society. And I feel like this is one of the things that is adding to that.
Well, you say it's anecdotal, but there certainly are edicts that have come out from places around the world. We'll talk about Trump in just a moment. But before that, the business secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, says he is convinced and seen evidence to say that working from home in one way or another, hybrid, does and will boost productivity. Do you agree with him?
I haven't seen any clear evidence on that. I mean, Goldman Sachs have been putting out a lot of studies over the years. It seems to fluctuate between it really hits productivity by about 15% or improves it by 15%, which I think comes back to that point of it works for some people, not for others, and in general, I think is probably a bad thing.
Where are you?
I think it's for individuals to decide how best to manage their work-life balance, and the best thing that a company can do is to get the most out of its workforce. You know, times are lean out there. And, you know, I'm sure around board room tables, they are wondering how do they improve their productivity. For some places, it will work. For others, I used to be a teacher. You absolutely can't do that. You're in early, you stay late, and you're there with the kids. So it really will depend.
But do you think then it's a good idea for the government to actually make it even easier with this Employment Rights Bill or not? Or
the Liberal Democrat view is that there should be a right to ask to work from home, and then if the business case could be made about why that's not allowed, fine. But I'll give you an example, and I know it's anecdotal, but, you know, I was at a meeting recently. A woman left, picked up her kids from school, rejoined the meeting online, was able to be there for the vast majority of the meeting, when if not being allowed to do that would have meant they would have missed most of it. That's productivity, in my view. That is an individual balancing work-life balance and being able to do more work. That's a good thing.
Can I just put something specifically to you? The Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp, told my colleague Nick Robinson last week that he thinks Britain is missing some hard work ethic. Is he right?
I think there's an awful lot of hard-working people out there who get up in the morning and go out to work. Of course, there are some who don't follow that ethic.
Yeah, but he was saying that it's missing here.
I think what we do know is that we need to boost our productivity. Yeah. I think that home working can work for some people. I think it can help some people, perhaps with an illness, get back to work. But I have some huge concerns over it, and I don't think it should be a given, and I don't think it should be an assumption that every employer, if asked, will automatically say yes.
I'll finish with Chris Philp does not understand working people. It's about balance, and it depends on the management and what they can get out of their team.
Right. and that's what you thought of Chris Philp. That's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of our guests. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at that earlier time of 11:15. Bye-bye.